my fellow assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins Podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So guys, what the heck is going on with Red Hat this week? I'm not sure if you heard the news. If you follow any kind of Linux or open source news, I'm sure you have most definitely heard the news about what Red Hat's doing, which we're going to talk about in this episode. As longtime listeners are aware, I am a Red Hat Enterprise Linux or RHEL user on some of the servers I have running in my homelab. Some people said they kind of saw this coming and it didn't really surprise them. But we got that to talk about. We also got some other pretty big updates to talk about. And I think this episode is going to be semi-packed. So let's get into it. So on the topic of Red Hat, let's get into this week's trivia question, which is, what year was Red Hat founded? Was it A, 1990, B, 2005, C, 2002, or D, 1993? So what year was Red Hat founded? And that is your trivia question for the week. Now, if you'll recall back to our episode on WWDC, we talked about how, the new visonOS and the new, I guess I can't call it a headset anymore, even though that's what it is, because it's a spatial computer, according to Apple anyway. But we talked about how the SDKs and the simulators weren't quite out yet, but now with the latest release of the Xcode 15 Beta 2, the visonOS SDK as well as the simulator are now available, so you can start developing your visonOS apps if you want to. And starting next month, so sometime in July, Apple will be opening up applications for developers to sign up to try to get their hands on a dev kit for the Vision Pro, so they can actually have some hands-on development with the device, so they can load their apps on the device to get a real sense of how their apps will perform rather than just working in the simulator. So obviously, if you've ever developed any kind of iOS apps or watchOS apps or tvOS apps or anything like that, obviously you can use the built-in simulators in Xcode. But you can also, if you have the hardware yourself, you can actually install the app directly on the device and test it out on the device to see how it functions. So I think from the experience aspect, if you were one of the lucky few, and I'm sure it's going to be few, and there's going to be a lot of people that are going to apply for it, if you are lucky enough to be able to get your hands on a dev kit, I think that would be a heck of a way to experience, your app in, visonOS, because it's one thing to use the simulator, but it's another thing to actually have the device on and experience it, especially when we're talking about, something that's going to be strapped to your face, and when you look around, things move with how you're looking and where you're looking and that kind of a thing. It's a lot different than, a simulator just on your computer screen. So obviously this is going to be heavily contested. That's why there's obviously an application process. Not everyone that applies is going to get in. And I think it probably goes without saying, you have to be one of the paid developers, paid that $99 a year, whatever it's license subscription, whatever they call it, to be an Apple developer in order to apply. And I would assume you basically saying, I want to develop an app for the Vision Pro headset is probably not going to win you the application, since I think you have a lot better chance if you're some kind of studio or some big time app developer. They're going to have a much better shot than just, your average Joe that happens to pay for an Apple developer account. But just so you're aware, they are planning on getting those shipped out and starting the application process next month. So I'll have some links down in the show notes below for those updates. Now let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. So for this week's cybersecurity tip, one thing that I believe most developers should have is their own personal website. I have my own personal website. I know other developers have their own websites. And even if you're not a developer, having a website out there to post your resume, post projects you've done, even if they're not, software related, just to kind of get yourself out there and kind of have basically an online footprint, online resume type thing. But why am I talking about having a website with a cybersecurity tip? Well, websites are one of since so much of the internet and traffic and whatnot is done through the web, websites are common targets for cyber attacks, and this week is no different. So the site the application, I guess, that everyone without programming knowledge loves to use to create their website, that being WordPress. I'm not sure if you've heard of WordPress before, but it's a pretty common way to make a website. It makes it pretty easy. But WordPress has had yet another serious vulnerability. So in this case, it has scored a CVSS score of 9.8, which, in case you're unaware, that's out of 10. So pretty big deal. So basically what this vulnerability did was it was a vulnerability in one of the plugins in WordPress that could enable a malicious actor to log in as any user provided information about the email address that they already know. So according to a researcher on the topic, they said, quote, "The vulnerability makes it possible for an unauthenticated attacker to gain access to any account on the site, including accounts used to administer the site, if the attacker knows or can find the associated email address." Now, if you use the same email address to administer your WordPress site as you did to register the domain, it is quite trivial for an attacker to find that email address. Now, there's a chance that they might have to shell out some money depending on how you acquired your domain, but there is a way that you can look up information about a domain, like when it was purchased, who purchased it, some contact information about the person. Now, depending on where you purchased your domain from, some sites will offer like privacy features, so they won't necessarily display all that information, but some places aren't as privacy focused, I guess we can say. So it shouldn't be too difficult for an attacker to figure out that email address. So assuming you're using that email address, you're basically giving them a freebie in this case. But WordPress in the past has been... It's had its fair share of vulnerabilities that are pretty serious when it comes to websites. But I'm not just picking on WordPress here, because we've talked before about another common vulnerability that attackers love to exploit is SQL injections. when it comes to websites. So if you're using any kind of back-end database, you really got to be sure that you are sanitizing any kind of query that goes into a database query, because if you've ever had to deal with user input from the security perspective, never trust anything that a user gives you. Always assume it's malicious unless you can prove otherwise. And that might be like thinking the worst in people, but if you think the best in people and you don't sanitize everything, that's how your entire SQL database gets dropped. And yeah, so it's not good. Or that's how your entire program crashes and the attacker pops a root shell on your machine because you allowed a buffer overflow. So obviously, whenever you're dealing with users, you got to make sure you're sanitizing your any input that they give you. So when it comes to building a website, there's a couple things that you really need to keep in mind from the cybersecurity perspective. And that is, like, what tools are you using to create the website? Like, are you using something like WordPress or some other website builder? Because those can have vulnerabilities in them. Are you using some kind of back-end manager, like maybe cPanel or something, to easily administer the back end of the website? Are you using some JavaScript, package or something that potentially could have vulnerabilities in it? There's a lot of stuff that you have to consider when building a website. So if you're strictly just building a website portfolio for yourself, in my opinion, the more static you can make it, the better. I know that might sound really boring, but the websites for darkassassins.inc.com and my personal website are literally just static websites, in the sense that there's no way for any user to interact with them, and all of the website is completely generated by code that I found from a template and modified the code to suit my liking to be the website. So literally, there's basically nothing an attacker can do to like hack the back end and like mess up the website, unless somehow they managed, I guess if they hacked my GitLab account, then they could potentially do some damage there. But I have two-factor authentication on there, and I have a security token through GitLab also, so I think the likelihood of that happening, obviously it can't be zero, but I think it's probably pretty darn low, seeing that they would somehow have to have access to my phone with the security code, two-factor code, and they'd have to have, well, I guess they might not necessarily need the token if they wanted to just do all the edits through the web interface. But yeah, they'd really, really have to go after it. And when they can just, attack a WordPress backend, I mean, that's a heck of a lot less work for them. So that's probably what they're going to go for. So yeah, whenever you're planning on making websites, definitely keep those things in mind. Keep in mind the tools you're using. Any kind of input, if you have any kind of user input fields, always be cautious about that. So just something to keep in mind, and that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Now, as far as other updates are concerned, Java 21 is currently in beta right now, but it brings some pretty substantial updates, especially to the beginner crowd. Now, I don't think you have to be a software developer to know about the Hello World program. So, and if you're unfamiliar with the Hello World program, it is the most simple program that you can write in any language, and is basically the first program that any kind of how-to guide, programming tutorial, programming class, anything will teach you how to do. And literally the whole point of this program is to print hello world to the screen, or display hello world in the GUI, or display it on the website, or whatever. It's basically show the text hello world. Now, anyone that's programmed in Java before knows that the hello world program is a lot more complex than it really needs to be. Because to write the hello world program in Java, you have to do public class, name of the class, curly brace, public static void main, parentheses, string args, and then there's like some closed brackets and closed parentheses there, and then another open curly brace. And then you do system.out.println, and then in quotes, hello world. And then you close those quotes, put a semicolon, and then you close out your curly braces. So that's quite a bit of information you have to type just to get a basic hello world program. Now, this obviously is in contrast to Python, which is literally just print and then hello world. That's it. Pretty simple. And I mean, even like C and C++ are pretty simple too. Like C, you make sure you do your pound include for stdio.h, and then you do int main, and then printf hello world. C++ is literally the same thing, except literally the same thing if you want it to be, because C, if you write C code, it's basically by default compatible with C++, but if you wanted to write native C++ code, it's basically the same, except instead you do a pound include IO stream, and then you do an std cout, and then you do your left arrows, and then hello world in quotes, and then there you go. So pretty simple. And then there's, of course, Java out here making it very complex, but they said no more. So now with the new beta version coming and the new updates coming to Java 21, now all you have to do is type void main and then your curly braces and, your parentheses and all that like you need for any kind of function. And then you do system.out.println and then hello world, and that's it. So it's literally they stripped out all of that public class and public static void main, all that stuff. So now you just have to type void main and then system.out.println. So this is definitely a lot more beginner friendly. Now, this update isn't coming out to the masses until September, although you can download an early access version from Java's website and you can play around with it. But one thing that I should mention about this is it's still technically a preview feature. So it's not like fully baked into the SDK that you download. So if you want to actually use the feature, you have to manually enable it through a couple of flags, like when you're compiling it and running the program. I'll have a link also in the show notes for some more information about that if you're curious. And with that, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So this week, unlike last week, was actually a fairly productive week when it comes to nerdy things. So I have another router update for you guys. Now, I mentioned months ago that I'd hope I'd never have another router update for you guys, assuming things went well. But this is actually something completely different. My router actually has been working fine, surprisingly. It hasn't had any crashing issues, so I think those fixes I made actually worked. But this week, what I did was I did a better implementation of DHCP. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what DHCP is, it's the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. So in normal human speak, basically what that means is when you connect to, say, a Wi-Fi network or you plug your computer in through an Ethernet jack, Basically, what happens is in order for you to connect to the internet and connect to other devices on your local area network or your LAN, you have to have an IP address. Now, there's a couple ways you can get an IP address. One of them is you can manually assign yourself an IP address, although this can potentially cause problems if you're not careful, because you have to make sure you configure everything properly, and two, you're not giving yourself an IP address that's already assigned to someone else. That will cause issues. So generally, how you get an IP address is through DHCP. And basically what happens is your computer or laptop, or well, I guess that's the same thing as a computer, or your phone or whatever, you reach out to the router and you basically say, hey, router, I'm connected. I want to connect to other devices on the LAN, and I want to connect to the internet. I need an IP address. Can you give me one? And then your router will be like, yep, sure thing. It finds an IP address that isn't assigned and gives that IP address to you. Now, obviously, this doesn't necessarily have to be your router specifically. You could have a separate DHCP server as well, but it's the same principle. Your router would have whatever the DHCP server is, whether that's itself or some other device on the network, and then that DHCP server would then assign you an IP address dynamically, hence the dynamic host portion of that. So that's DHCP in a nutshell. So basically I had a predicament because before I had essentially an all or nothing approach when it came to DHCP and my internal server network. So I've talked about it before in the past, but I essentially have two networks at my house. The one is just kind of the generic, normie network, I guess you could say. So this is like basically what I connect my phone to, what I connect most of my laptops to, what I connect like my TV to, any kind of device I just need to connect to the internet, generally use that. And then for my homelab stuff and any computers that I need connected into the homelab, basically all the time, I connect those to an internal server network. Now, the problem was I could either have DHCP enabled to allow my Wi-Fi devices that I want to connect to the internal server network. I could have DHCP turned on so they could connect. The only problem is doing that would also allow every other Wi-Fi device to connect to the internal server network, which obviously from a security standpoint is not good. But I could also turn that off, but then I'd have to manually set IP addresses for all my Wi-Fi devices, which generally isn't an issue. But one of the issues that I actually ran into was if I do any kind of like traveling or something, when I would connect to Wi-Fi at the place I was traveling to, I would usually notice that I wouldn't have internet, and then I'd kind of wonder what the heck is going on for a couple minutes, and then realize, oh yeah, I manually set my static IP address, so then I'd have to, but because I set it manually, it was trying to connect to a default gateway or the router that did not exist. So because the router, according to my computer, did not exist, it could not connect to the internet, even though I was connected to Wi-Fi and should have had internet access. So in order to prevent that headache, I wanted DHCP. But like I said, the problem was if I had DHCP on, then I would allow every device to connect. So basically what I did was I went into the router settings and set it to be more restrictive. So before it was... So basically now I have it set where it basically will do kind of like a MAC address filtering more or less. So if it's a MAC address that it recognizes, it'll assign it an IP address. But if it's a MAC address it doesn't recognize, it'll just ignore it, and then that will go get a IP address from my regular normie network, I guess you could say. So now everything since then has been working great. The devices I want on my internal server network are there, and devices that I don't want are not there. So that was a big win. And the other updates I have is I did some updates to my video game that I've been making. So I believe I've mentioned it before plenty of times that I'm basically trying to make my own Pokemon game, right? So I added the original trainer ID to the Pokemon types. So that was a pretty basic change. But the more crucial change I made, which actually code-wise wasn't all that big, was the functionality to actually catch a Pokemon. Now, if you've ever played any Pokemon game, you obviously know that catching plays a pretty big role in the game, I'd say. So while code-wise, it's really not that big as far as implementing, like the actual catching mechanism and the calculation that goes into the catching mechanism is honestly quite small. Like, I think we're talking probably less than 50 lines worth of code. Like, it's pretty small. I mean, I guess if you compound it with the catch probability of every single Pokemon and the enumerations for the Pokeball types, you could maybe argue it's going to be larger. But the actual functions themselves that handle that calculation is quite small. But that was definitely a big feature that needed to be implemented. And also during my updates, I also removed a lot of dead code. And what do I mean by dead code? So if you've never heard of dead code, it's basically kind of what it sounds like. It's code that's dead or doesn't get used. And it's almost impossible to write a programming project or any kind of project that involves code without accruing dead code along the way. And the main reason for this is because as you go through your development cycle and your development process, things are going to change, right? As you get into the project, maybe the approach you originally were thinking about going with either didn't work, you found a better solution, or you found a more optimal way to do something. So there's a lot of different ways why you might initially write a function and it turns out that you don't actually end up using that function, and this is how dead code accrues. So obviously, I've mentioned in the past that I kind of did a massive overhaul of the back end of the code to like optimize the heck out of it. And during that optimization process, I generated a ton of dead code because I found better ways to do things. I found things that I didn't need anymore. So basically, I accrued a bunch of dead code. So I did the kind of tedious process of going through and removing as much of that dead code as I could. Now, one of the reasons why it can be kind of hard to remove dead code is depending on how spaghettified your code base is, it can be quite a challenge to find all the places that code has embedded itself in. And yeah, sure, you can do a find and replace on your entire project and strip it out. But the problem is, depending on how that function that is you're now calling a dead code segment, dead function, depending on how embedded that function was into another function that was calling it, it could also break that function. So just because you think something might be dead code, it might actually be playing a role somewhere else. But if that code is something you truly want to be dead and remove, you have to figure out all the places where it's being called and somehow figure out a solution for it if it is being called elsewhere. So depending on how entangled and spaghettified your code base is, or how large your code base is, it can be quite tedious to remove dead code from your code base because of how interconnected some things can be. So sure, you could just go into your header file or go into your file where the function's declared and just delete it and go the nuclear option, which a benefit to that nuclear option is, assuming you're using a compiled language, the compiler will basically tell you exactly where all the instances of that function being called were immediately. And it will not have a fun time, and you will have a massive spew of red text in your output, and it will look very angry. But on the bright side, as you clean it up and start removing all the locations, that amount of red, angry-looking error messages gets less and less and less until it's finally all gone, and presumably the code works. But obviously, we all know just because a program compiles does not mean it works. So just because you removed all the dead code and it compiles, you still have to go through all your testing to make sure you're still getting the outputs that you want, because you could still have problems. Just because it compiled, that doesn't really mean much. And the other thing with dead code is it could also potentially pose a security risk too, because depending on how long that code has been dead and just floating around your code base, there's a good chance that that code has not been updated in a while, which, depending on what libraries you're using or how you coded it originally, there's chances that you could have bugs in there that you didn't have before in your actual code base. And depending on what those bugs are, could potentially pose security vulnerabilities. So if for some reason you or someone down the line or someone else on your team implements that dead code because they see it, the function name, and they think, oh, this could be useful, and then literally out of nowhere, you have this bug that pops up in your code, having to track that down could potentially pose a problem. And it could also potentially add a security vulnerability to your code. So it's definitely best that if you truly have dead code and the code is no longer needed, that you actually get rid of it, which I know can be hard to do. I know personally, when I write code or write a big function and realize I don't need it and have to delete it, it's really hard to actually delete that function, because I'm like, what if I need it later? But see, this is where source control comes into play, because if you're using source control, like something like Git, for example, it really doesn't matter if you delete that function and realize you actually needed it later, because you can just go back through your source control and find where that function was implemented again, and you can just go back to it, copy it, and you're back to where you want to be. So you really don't have to worry about it. So there's another tip for you, that you should definitely be using source control. But yeah, obviously another thing with dead code is it makes your executable more bloated. So if you're using a compiled language, every line of code that you write gets compiled into the binary. So if you have dead code that's literally just extra space in the binary, not doing anything, so extra bloat. Another problem with dead code, I mentioned this potential security vulnerability aspect. Depending on what your dead code function does, depending on if you have other security vulnerabilities in your code, like for example, if you have a buffer overflow exploit somewhere in your code that an attacker could exploit, and you have some other dead code function buried in your executable that, say, you put in there for debugging purposes that will, pop a shell or something, I mean, you're just making the attacker's life easy because that code is literally already in the executable. They literally just have to do their buffer overflow exploit, point it to where that code is in memory in the executable, and then bingo bango, they easily exploited your code. So don't give the attackers that much ease. Make it difficult for them to exploit your programs by practicing good cybersecurity principles when you're programming and removing your dead code, which I know can be kind of hard to do. It's like I mentioned, depending on how entangled things are and how big the code base is, but it's definitely something that you should try to do. Now, I think it's probably about time that we address the elephant in the room, that being Red Hat and their announcement that they made this past week. So Red Hat decided to stop making its source code available to everyone. Now, I carefully worded my words there because their source code still technically is open source. Now, the reason it's not available to everyone yet still open source is because Red Hat decided to put the source code for Red Hat Enterprise Linux essentially behind a paywall. So basically, if you're a paying Red Hat customer or you have a free developer account like I do, you can still get access to the source code through their Red Hat customer portal, but you also have to sign an agreement that basically says you're not gonna download the source code, repackage it, and, make a new product out of it. Like, basically what Alma Linux and Rocky Linux are doing, which they're taking the current version of Red Hat, stripping out all the Red Hat branding and creating it as a new thing. And the reason they're able to do this is because it's Linux. Linux is open source. It's under the GPL license. So literally the only thing about Red Hat that makes Red Hat, I guess, proprietary in the sense that only Red Hat can produce Red Hat is because of the trademark that Red Hat has on the Red Hat imagery and the Red Hat name and the logos and all that good stuff. So, but if you strip all that out, I mean, it's just open source software. So at that point, you're free to do what you want. But Red Hat is now not allowing you to even do that. Now, I hear some of you saying out there, but Linux is GPL, which means it's supposed to be open source and everyone, available. And now, obviously, I am no lawyer here, but from the research that I've done on the topic, my understanding is that because they're still providing the source code to their customers or the people that are either paying or using Red Hat, which is those that either have a developer license and can download the source code that way or get the 16 licenses that way, or those that are paying for a support contract through Red Hat and get the ISOs and the OS that way. Those are the ones that are going to be using it, and the source code is available to those people, which, to my understanding, as long as your source code is available to those who are using the application, it is GPL compliant. That's at least my understanding, but again, I'm no lawyer. So this news is pretty bad for Alma Linux and Rocky Linux. Now, if you're not really super in tune with the Linux space, basically Alma Linux and Rocky Linux are binary clones of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And basically what we mean by binary clones is, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, they take the open source code that Red Hat produced, and they would strip out all the Red Hat branding, repackage it, and release that as their own version of Linux. Now, we say it's a binary clone because literally all the source code is exactly the same. All the binaries are the same. Literally the only difference is it doesn't have the Red Hat branding. That's the only difference. So by Red Hat now putting its code behind essentially a paywall, Alma Linux and Rocky Linux aren't just going to be able to, basically download the latest updates from the Red Hat source code, repackage it, and ship it out to their users as updates. They're not going to be able to do that anymore. So it's going to be a lot harder for them to basically be a one-to-one replication of Red Hat. Now, theoretically, they could use CentOS Stream, but if you're familiar with the Linux space, that's not the same thing as Red Hat, because while back in the day, CentOS used to be downstream of Red Hat like Alma and Rocky Linux is, I guess as a quick history lesson for people that aren't aware of this whole situation, back before Red Hat bought CentOS, and even after Red Hat bought CentOS up until maybe a year or two ago, CentOS was essentially a downstream of Red Hat and a one-to-one clone. So basically, CentOS was doing the exact same thing that Rocky Linux and Alma Linux are doing now, which is taking the Red Hat source code, stripping out the Red Hat branding, and releasing it as CentOS. But within the past year or two, I forget exactly when this happened, Red Hat transitioned CentOS to be upstream and called it CentOS Stream. So basically what this means is rather than CentOS being below Red Hat and pulling from Red Hat is now pulling from CentOS, and CentOS Stream has some features that Red Hat doesn't necessarily have. And because Red Hat is downstream, if Red Hat makes some kind of fix to, say some bug or vulnerability, that's not necessarily going to be immediately pushed back up to CentOS. So creating a exact direct binary clone of Red Hat through the CentOS source code is going to be quite challenging, to say the least. So basically, now Red Hat says that they push all their changes upstream. They after all this backlash happened, one of their vice presidents, I forget exactly who, I'll have the blog post linked in the show notes, their response. But basically, in there they mentioned that they're always pushing back upstream and all this stuff, but there's also, I believe, some embargoes too in the Red Hat source code that won't immediately get pushed upstream. There's a bunch to it. So, but basically, the in a nutshell, it's gonna be very hard to basically replicate this one-to-one binary and be a one-to-one clone of Red Hat, essentially. Now, this also kind of puts the users of Alma Linux and Rocky Linux kind of in a tight spot, since it's what do they do now? Are they not going to get updates anymore? But Alma Linux and Rocky Linux both have stated that they're currently looking for a way forward and urge the community not to panic. So you heard them, don't panic. Which, of course, if the cartoons are to be believed, this is when all the panic starts happening. Now, Rocky Linux actually went as far as to say, quote, rumors of Rocky Linux's death have been greatly exaggerated. So I guess in their opinion, they have a good idea of how they're planning on keeping the, I guess, one-to-one or as close to one-to-one replica of Red Hat as they can. But it still does put them in a tight spot, because in a way, I guess you could say like Alma Linux and Rocky Linux and CentOS before that was, I guess, the poor man's Red Hat, I guess you could say, because it's literally Red Hat, but without actually paying for it. Now, back when anyone could access the Red Hat source code, the thing that made Red Hat different was the support contracts, which is how Red Hat makes its money. So while, yes, it's Red Hat at the end of the day is just Linux, if you go and say download, the latest copy of Arch Linux and install it yourself and you run into a problem, you basically have no one to help you. Now, there's obviously the wiki, there's the forums, there's definitely ways that you can ask for help. But the thing that made Red Hat special is that if you have a support contract with them, if you have an issue, you can go directly to Red Hat and they'll help you out. So that's kind of the benefit that Red Hat provides. And the other thing that they provide too is long-term support. Like, they support their operating systems for a long time. Like, I think usually they're kind of in like the neighborhood of like close to like 10 years of support, which for the enterprise world is a huge deal. Having that length of support for an operating system is huge. Now, when it comes to why Red Hat made this decision, it's kind of hard to say definitively, but if you're unaware, the company IBM, they own Red Hat. So IBM bought Red Hat back in 2019, and as a subsidiary of IBM, it wouldn't surprise me if IBM wants one of their subsidiaries, one of their cash cows, to make them more money. That potentially could be a reason, and by essentially killing off people's access to the Red Hat clones or the free versions of Red Hat or whatever you want to call them, that being like Alma Linux and Rocky Linux, that would essentially force people that want to use enterprise Linux to Red Hat and to buy a support contract from Red Hat, thus generating IBM and Red Hat more money. Now, on the flip side, which is also kind of interesting, is Debian 12 released only a few weeks before this announcement came out, and Debian 12 has received some pretty high praise for how good it is. And Debian is essentially another widely used server operating system, for mainly because of how stable it is. It's one of the most stable Linux distros, basically next to Red Hat, as far as how stable it is. And part of that is because it generally has slightly older packages, but they're more matured. There's a heck of a lot less bugs because nothing's bleeding edge. So you have a lot more stability in Debian. So I think there's probably going to be a decent amount of people just bypassing the RHEL, the enterprise Linux, the Alma Linux, Rocky Linux, and be like, all right, if we're going to have to pay, we can just go over to Debian, and that's also really stable for us. So it'll be kind of interesting to see how this turns out. So IBM or Red Hat might not necessarily see their profits increasing because people are turning to Red Hat to pay for a subscription. I guess we'll see what happens. But the other thing too, which is kind of odd, I guess, is Red Hat recently had some pretty substantial layoffs not too long ago. So potentially this could be a means for them to, again, try to make more money. Since maybe they're going through a bit of a financial rough patch. But at the same time, according to IBM's own metrics, money shouldn't be an issue for them or Red Hat or I guess maybe not IBM, but for Red Hat specifically, according to IBM's earnings report for the first quarter of 2023, Red Hat was up 8% over the last year. So obviously Red Hat made money. They were up 8%, so they weren't losing IBM money. So losing money wasn't an issue. So I don't know. Maybe it's really hard to see exactly why they went this route. Now, in the response to the backlash, the vice president that made the follow-up blog post on Red Hat essentially said that, in not so nice words that I'm putting it, that he didn't like the freeloaders that wanted Red Hat but didn't want to pay for Red Hat and didn't want to support all the development and support that goes into Red Hat. They just want the operating system for free. And that's basically what he was calling the Red Hat clones that basically just repackage and redistribute Red Hat without actually adding anything to it. Now, as we mentioned, because of the open source nature and the GPL, they're in their right to do that. Like, they can take source code that is under the GPL license and essentially repackage it, rebrand it, and call it their own. They're allowed to do that. But I guess Red Hat didn't exactly like that. Now, the reason why this is also a big deal is because Red Hat is, they're the second largest contributor to the Linux kernel as of 2016. So if Red Hat somehow went under or lost a substantial amount of their developers to develop both Red Hat and the Linux kernel, that would be a huge hit to the development of the Linux kernel. Now, I don't think it really matters what you think of these larger companies that deal with open source software, whether it's Red Hat, Canonical, which makes Ubuntu, IX Systems, which is basically the creator of TrueNAS, Netgate, which basically creates pfSense. I mean, there's a lot of company-backed open source projects that produce a ton of source code for not only Linux, but the software that runs on Linux and other open source software that people use on a daily basis. So if you remove these companies that write a bunch of the source code for these open source projects, that leaves a huge hole to be filled. Now, one thing you also have to keep in mind about open source is, unlike working for a company like Google or Microsoft or Apple or any other tech company that writes code, most of the code that those companies write is proprietary. And the way they make their money is by selling the software product as, the product, and that's how they make their money back. But if you're an open source developer, you're literally giving the source code to everyone. So anyone who wants to can download your source code, build it themselves, and have the executable or the application or whatever and not have to pay anything. So making money in open source is basically a problem that hasn't really been solved. And I don't have the answer. If I did, I probably would have a lot of money, because I feel like there's probably a lot of money in this solution, because the issue is somehow you have to generate money for it to fund the development, because as much as we software developers love writing code, and as much joy as we get out of it, we also have bills to pay. We have to eat at some point. We need a place to live, and these things cost money. Now, we do not currently live in a world where you can write code all day and have all of your expenses magically paid for without you actually earning any money. That is not the world we live in. So you have to make money somehow, and doing that through open source can be kind of a tricky thing to do, because one way that people will do it is through donations, but the problem with donations is donations aren't exactly a very stable source of income. So some ways that people do it is like how Red Hat does it through like support contracts or service agreements. There's other ways that people can do it. Some will do like a license thing, where they'll make the source code freely available, but they'll have a license aspect to it where maybe unless you pay money for a license, so they'll like lock off some of the features. But then again, since it's open source, if you really wanted to, you could just download it yourself, remove that part of the code that doesn't allow you to access it unless you have a license. So it's pretty hard to, balance the open source nature and make money off of it at the same time. So I obviously don't have the answer. But another reason why it's important, like these companies, while you might not necessarily like them and, their business practices or whatever, like I mentioned, because they write so much of the source code, if you think that, say, like Red Hat and some of these other big companies that contribute to the Linux kernel just went out of business and no longer existed, all of that development from the Linux kernel is now gone. And according to some estimates, 60 to 70% of the servers that run the internet use Linux. So if Linux no longer gets updates because there's not enough companies or people or whatever contributing code in a timely fashion to patch updates, or patch vulnerabilities rather, that's a large portion of the internet that could be susceptible to cyber attacks, which I don't think you need me to tell you that that is not a good thing. So if you don't have these large companies that are producing a ton of code for, these open source projects and Linux in general, Linux would fall behind from its competitors like Windows and Mac OS and other operating systems. It would fall behind. The number of vulnerabilities would increase probably a lot quicker than they could be patched. So you're essentially just have a bunch of sitting duck servers out there just waiting to be attacked by attackers because there aren't enough developers to work on the vulnerabilities to patch and fix them, which is part of the good thing. It's the blessing and the curse of open source, because on the one hand, the code is freely open, so anyone can look at it, anyone can audit it, and anyone can find vulnerabilities in it. So it's a blessing because you have a lot of eyes on the code. So if there's a vulnerability in there, it can be patched fairly quickly with all the people looking at it and developing on it. But at the same time, because everyone can look at it, if an attacker can find the vulnerability first and they make an exploit for it, they can start, going to work and hacking people before that vulnerability can be patched and the update can be pushed out. So if you have a longer time between the time where the vulnerability is detected and patched versus the time that the attackers find said vulnerability and start actively exploiting it, the longer that window gets, the worse it gets. So you want that to be as short as possible, and by removing a lot of the contributors to the code, that's just going to make that time longer on average. So that's something that isn't good. So at the end of the day, Red Hat definitely made some moves, not just here, but in the past couple years. I know when they switched CentOS 8 over to CentOS Stream, that ruffled a lot of people's feathers. I think a large portion of that was they told people that they were going to support CentOS 8 for like 10 years, and then like a year later they were like, nope, not doing that anymore. So that definitely ruffled some people's feathers. They also mentioned that they would keep the source code available for Red Hat, and now they've changed that. So they've definitely made people upset, and I think for good reason. and I guess it partly goes back to that saying of, if you put something out on the internet and you give it away for free, it's almost impossible to basically take that away and charge for it and people to be okay with that. Now, if you always charged for it in the first place, that's different. But Red Hat had always made their source code freely available to everyone, not just only available to the developers and those with developer accounts and the paying customers. So, I mean, I don't think Red Hat's going anywhere. They obviously, from the earnings report, are doing pretty well, even though they had some large layoffs not too long ago. Financially, they seem to be doing fine. It will be interesting to see how this move shapes up in the enterprise world. I mean, quite honestly, I don't really see it affecting enterprises that already have contracts with Red Hat. I don't see this changing anything with them. The only thing I think it would affect is the people that are using something like Rocky Linux or Alma Linux. I think those are the only people that might be affected in any kind of regard, because those are the only people that are using something akin to Red Hat. But depending on who they are, they might just be mad at Red Hat's decision and go to something else like Debian, for example. So personally, I don't necessarily think that this is going to make a huge dent in Red Hat's finances at all. I don't think, I just kind of don't see it. But also, on the other hand, I don't know, from the open source community perspective, while we might be mad at Red Hat, I don't know if we necessarily want them to basically go out of business because of this, because as I mentioned, they're, the second largest contributor to the Linux kernel. So you remove that piece of the puzzle, who's going to fill the shoes? So there's definitely a lot of things that have to be considered. Now, obviously, if you are using Red Hat and you want to support the open source community, and you don't stand for the principle that Red Hat is doing here, I mean, by all means, you can go ahead and cancel your subscription and no longer pay for it. And because, I mean, at the end of the day, as consumers, right, that's really the only power we have, is to essentially vote with our wallets, as it were. And if we don't support something that the company is doing, we just simply don't provide them any more financial contribution. We just don't pay for their product. And because Red Hat is a product you have to pay for, assuming you're not in the free developer tier, since it's something you have to pay for, if you want to voice your displeasure for what they're doing, just simply cancel your subscription and switch to a different Linux distro. There's plenty of them out there. Now, obviously, I know that's a lot easier said than done. It's not a simple task to just be like, oh, don't want to use this operating system anymore, let me just switch over to this other one. That's obviously not something you can do overnight. That's something that takes a lot of planning and effort, but something definitely to consider if you are a Red Hat paying subscriber and you are not a fan of this decision. Really, the only thing I can tell you is vote with your wallet. And for those of you who don't like this decision, that are not Red Hat paying subscribers and don't have a Red Hat developer license, well, I guess there really isn't much I can say to you. You already don't give them money, so you're already doing your part, I guess. So congrats. As for me, since I don't give Red Hat money, I am in the free developer tier. I'm not sure what I'm gonna do. I'll probably just keep using the versions of Red Hat that I'm using. It's not like I give them money, so it's not like I'm necessarily contributing to them at all, because I'm not paying for a subscription to their support services or whatever. But one thing I did find kind of funny that I thought too for like half a second and realized this definitely isn't the case, but it's, that conspiracy theorist in me that likes to make up random conspiracy theories that are obviously not true, but are like so bad that, you're like, maybe. And that being that, I obviously, as the longtime listeners are aware, basically told you how you can get unlimited Red Hat licensed, machines for free, essentially. And even though you're only technically allowed 16, you can have as many as you want for free. I called it the Red Hat Infinite Money Glitch. So I was like, maybe everyone was just taking advantage of that, and Red Hat was losing a lot of money. So this is the reason why they're doing this. But then at the same time, that anyone with a couple brain cells would easily be able to decipher that is not the case, because one, if everyone was doing this, first off, Red Hat making their source code no longer available to everyone and only those with developer accounts and paid subscribers, that obviously wouldn't do anything, because you would already be a subscriber, or a developer, so you'd already have access to it, so that wouldn't do anything. So yeah, obviously not true, but I thought it was kind of a funny thought. Anyway, on the topic of Red Hat, our trivia question was about Red Hat, so let's get back to our trivia question. So if you'll recall, this week's trivia question is, what year was Red Hat founded? Was it A, 1990, B, 2005, C, 2002, or D, 1993? Now, if you said A, 1990, you are wrong. If you said C, 2002, you're also wrong. But if you said D, 1993, you are correct. Red Hat was founded back in 1993. So, any of you wanting to learn some Red Hat trivia on an episode where we talked a lot about Red Hat, and in a week filled with Red Hat drama, there you go. So if you enjoyed this episode, I ask that you leave it a rating and review, and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Also, be sure to share it with a friend or family member. And if you have any questions or comments about this show, or have any topics for future episodes, feel free to shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. Link down in the show notes below as usual. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.